The stench hit me before I even saw the bulldozer. It was that ripe, unmistakable mix of disturbed sewage and chlorine, like someone had tried to clean a toilet with a swimming pool. I dropped my suitcase on the porch and froze. My backyard, the one I mowed just 2 weeks ago before leaving for a state environmental health conference, was now a crater. A construction crew in neon vests stood ankle-deep in a half-dug pit, surrounded by PVC pipes, rebar, and mounds of soil that, horrifyingly, looked and smelled like they'd come straight from beneath my septic field. And standing right in the middle of it all, grinning like she'd just personally discovered gold, was Karen, the president of our HOA, wearing a wide sun hat and holding a clipboard like she was directing a movie. When I asked what in the hell they were doing, she said it like it was a birthday surprise. "We're building a community pool. Right here. Isn't it exciting?" I blinked. I wanted to laugh, cry, and vomit, possibly in that order. "You're digging into my septic system," I said. She rolled her eyes and waved me off. "Oh, that thing? We'll work around it." I stood there in disbelief, thinking, you just declared war on the wrong guy, and you have no idea I'm the one who writes the health codes you just broke. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a fit. I just quietly walked inside, pulled my shoes off so I didn't track emotional devastation into the house, and made a list. I am a health inspector for the state, and I've seen some disgusting, reckless, and downright criminal abuses of property before, but never in my own backyard. Literally. That field they were digging into wasn't just some muddy spot behind a fence. It was my septic drain field. My entire house's plumbing depended on that ground being left untouched. And Karen, in all her clipboard-wielding wisdom, decided to build a swimming pool on it without even so much as a phone call. I walked back out, trying to stay calm. "Who approved this?" I asked one of the workers. He looked confused and pointed to Karen. "She said the HOA owns this patch," he muttered. "Said she had all the paperwork." I glanced at the property stakes. They were moved. Subtly, but moved. Enough to give the illusion that the pool was on community land. My name was still on the mailbox, and my tax bills certainly didn't say anything about this being up for grabs. The worst part? Karen acted like she'd done me a favor. "You'll have prime pool access," she said, like this was a hotel upgrade and not a health hazard. "Karen, this land contains a waste disposal system," I said, slowly, as though speaking to a toddler who had just smeared peanut butter on a laptop. "It processes all the gray and black water from my house. You can't build over it. It's illegal, not to mention dangerous." She gave me a dismissive little laugh. "We'll just reroute it or whatever. The board voted. You're outvoted." She turned her attention back to the contractor, snapping orders and talking about water features. I wanted to reach into my chest, pull out my internal organs, and scream, "This is what will back up into your pool." Instead, I did what I do best. I documented. I took photos from every angle. I emailed myself timestamp. I pulled out my septic system diagrams, permits, and property lines. I made a copy of everything. And then I called a few colleagues, quietly. Not as a neighbor. As a state-certified environmental compliance officer. That night, I sat in my kitchen, looking out the window at the industrial lighting they'd installed for night construction. One of the diggers had churned right through a vent pipe. I could see it sticking out of the dirt like a snapped bone. The air smelled foul. No, not foul. Apocalyptic. And I just knew that in less than a week, that entire pit was going to become a bacterial petri dish of neighborhood regret. The next morning, I got an official-looking notice stuck to my door. HOA emblem. Karen's signature. It was a violation. For obstructing a community improvement project. My crime? Telling the crew they might want to pause until they verified the land wasn't, a literal health hazard. I laughed so hard I spilled coffee on it. Then I scanned it, filed it, and made another call. I tried reaching out to the HOA board directly. One of them was a timid guy named Stan who never spoke above a whisper. He apologized profusely and said he thought we were just adding a bench or something. Another board member claimed Karen told them I'd donated the land for communal upgrades. That lie burned me. I don't donate human waste zones for public cannonballs, not even on my worst day. As the days went by, the situation spiraled. The construction continued. Karen doubled down. Neighbors started murmuring when their lawns began to smell off. A few noticed water pooling near their fences. I got a knock on my door from a guy across the street asking if I was having plumbing problems. Funny you should ask, I said, motioning toward the absurd gaping hole behind me. They're putting a swimming pool over my sewage system. He blinked. Wait, that's legal? I smiled. Not even a little. But I didn't just want to stop the project. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to feel the same panic I felt watching strangers dig up my property with zero warning. I wanted to teach Karen a lesson that would echo through every bad HOA meeting from here to the end of time. And I had the credentials, the documentation, and the righteous fury to make it happen. So I waited, quietly, like a septic system under pressure. Because the best part about being underestimated? No one sees it coming when you blow the whole thing wide open. For the next few days, I let them dig. I watched from my window as Karen strutted around the crater like a suburban pharaoh, barking orders at the crew and waving her clipboard like it was a scepter. They poured gravel, laid piping, even set up the steel framing for the pool's foundation. And all the while, they were trampling deeper and deeper into the very field designed to slowly, carefully disperse the waste from my home. Every morning I'd wake up to the beeping of machinery, the clatter of tools, and that now familiar stench of disturbed soil laced with something far less pleasant. It would have been impressive if it weren't so profoundly illegal. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. I needed them to go far enough that there was no plausible deniability left. I wanted permits to be forged, statements to be made, and construction to be committed, all with Karen's fingerprints all over it. So I smiled, nodded, and played dumb. When Karen waved at me one morning and shouted, "We're ahead of schedule," I gave her a thumbs up. Then I walked back inside and updated my file. That file was already growing into a beast. I had blueprints of my property showing the septic field, including stamped approvals from the county health department dated and signed. I had photos of the excavation from day one to present, including multiple shots of exposed pipes and backflow vent damage. I had aerial drone images a neighbor's teenager kindly provided in exchange for $10 and a promise not to tell his parent. And I had my favorite addition. Screenshots of the HOA's internal email chain, courtesy of a board member who, as it turned out, really didn't like Karen. Stan, the quiet board member, had reached out again. He asked if we could talk privately. We met on his porch at dusk, the hum of cicadas covering our voices. He looked nervous, but determined. "She told us we had approval from you," he said, eyes darting around. "Said it was part of some easement agreement you signed last year." My face probably turned to stone. I never signed anything. I would never give up part of my septic field. He nodded quickly. "I believe you. She just steamrolls people. She said if we didn't vote yes, we'd be removed from the board." It was worse than I thought. Not only had Karen lied to the other board members, she'd also threatened them into silence. It wasn't incompetence, it was manipulation. And unfortunately for her, that was something my office took even more seriously than broken pipe. I thanked Stan, gave him my card, not my neighbor card, my official state ID card, and told him to hang tight. Things were about to change. The next morning, I dressed in a crisp polo embroidered with the state health department's seal, khakis, and a ball cap. I looked every bit the government official I was. I casually walked into the HOA office, clipboard in hand, and greeted the receptionist with a polite nod. "Hi," I said. "Just conducting a routine review of community compliance documentation. I understand there's some construction underway?" The receptionist looked startled, then immediately nervous. Yeah. The pool. Do you want me to get Karen? No need, I said, flipping open my clipboard. Just need to review the construction permits, soil safety reports, groundwater analysis, and sewage redirection plans. Her eyes widened. I'm not sure we have all that. I smiled. I'll wait. She scrambled into the back, and I could hear whispered voices and frantic paper shuffling. Karen eventually emerged, wearing oversized sunglasses and her usual sun hat, trying to look like she hadn't just been panicking in the copy room. Well, well, she said with mock cheerfulness. Nice of you to stop by. Are you here to finally support the project? I'm here to review the project, I said calmly. As part of a state compliance check. You understand. Her face twitched. Of course, she said slowly. But I assure you, everything's in order. All voted on and approved by the board. Great, I said, tapping my pen. Then I'd love to see the groundwater report, especially since you're digging into a known leach field. She hesitated. We didn't think that would be an issue. It's just dirt. It's not, I said. It's a critical waste management system. Disrupting it without analysis could contaminate not just your pool, but the surrounding properties. Her confidence started to fracture. Well, I'm sure we can submit something soon. You'd better, I said, and turned to leave. You'll be hearing from my office. Have a good day. From there, the dominoes began to fall. I filed the preliminary concerns through my agency's online portal, anonymously, for now, and activated the inspection schedule for non-compliant developments. My district had a backlog, sure, but something like this? A possible environmental hazard tied to a misuse of homeowner association power? That got flagged. Within 48 hours, a formal inspection was on the calendar. While the wheels of bureaucracy turned, I got busy organizing the neighborhood. I started knocking on doors. Not ranting, not accusing, just asking questions. Had they been notified about the pool project? Did they vote? Did they know about the septic system? One elderly couple invited me in and told me their dog had gotten sick from drinking runoff water that had pooled near their porch. Another family said they'd lost access to their garage for 3 days because the construction crew had blocked their driveway. And nearly everyone I spoke to said the same thing. They had no idea this project was happening until the digging started. I shared what I could, without breaking any rules. I told them the pool was illegal, unsafe, and possibly going to contaminate more than just my backyard. And slowly, people started talking. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a ghost town of lawn care tips and lost cat notices, lit up with screenshots, questions, and fury. Karen tried to respond at first, but it was too late. The narrative had shifted. She went from confident leader to desperate spin doctor overnight. She called an emergency HOA meeting to try and spin things back in her favor. I went, of course, and took a seat in the front row. She opened with her usual theatrics, thanking everyone for their patience and praising the progress of the pool. But the moment she asked for a vote of confidence, half the room erupted in protest. People stood up, shouted questions, demanded answers. Stan, quiet no more, stood and declared the board had been misled. Karen's face went pale. She tried to pivot. We're enhancing property values, she insisted. This is for everyone's benefit. I raised my hand. And what about the public health hazard? The septic field you've destroyed? She waved her hand again. It's being handled. By who? I asked. Because the health department hasn't received a single application, plan, or report. And as of tomorrow, they'll be inspecting the site. The room fell silent. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For once, she had no snark, no retort, no manufactured confidence. Just silence. And for me, it was glorious. I didn't need revenge through shouting. I didn't need to throw fists or tear down banners. All I needed was the truth. And now it was out in the open, festering just like the pit behind my house. The countdown had begun. The inspection team arrived on a Wednesday morning, unannounced to everyone but me. That was part of the magic. Officially, it was a routine spot check triggered by irregular construction permits and flagged environmental risk factors. Unofficially, it was my surgical strike. 2 white state vehicles rolled up just after 8 a.m., quiet and unassuming, carrying 3 inspectors armed with clipboards, testing kits, cameras, and a level of calm professionalism that always signaled someone was about to be very, very screwed. Karen was still inside the HOA office, sipping her morning smoothie when the first sample was taken from the now exposed leach field. The inspectors moved with purpose, photographing disrupted piping, testing the soil, and checking for groundwater contamination. One of them crouched down, opened a small valve that had been torn loose during construction, and recoiled. He turned to me with a grimace and said, "Yeah, this whole area is shot." I kept my distance, letting them work. I knew the process. First the site documentation, then interviews with involved parties, and finally the cross-reference with filed permits, or lack thereof. The moment Karen stepped outside and saw the inspectors, her smoothie nearly hit the pavement. She rushed over, flustered and confused, demanding to know what was going on. One of the inspectors calmly introduced himself, explained the purpose of the visit, and asked if she had the required documentation on hand. She stammered, offering vague answers and gesturing toward the office. I could see it in her eyes, panic. Real panic. The kind you feel when you realize your house of cards is made of wet tissue. While the inspectors did their thing, I called a few of the neighbors who had expressed interest in witnessing justice unfold. Within an hour, small clusters of curious homeowners were watching from across the street or peeking through hedges. It wasn't exactly a parade, but the tension in the air made it feel like one. And Karen knew it. She tried everything, smiling, blaming the contractor, pretending it was all just a misunderstanding. But the inspectors weren't interested in excuses. They were interested in fact, and the facts were not on her side. By noon, construction was halted. A bright orange notice was posted on the makeshift fencing surrounding the site. Stop work, environmental compliance order. Karen stood frozen in front of it, hands on hips, trying to process what had just happened. She looked like a woman watching her castle burn while still holding the match. I didn't say anything to her that day. I didn't need to. The silence between us was loud enough. Later that evening, I received a call from the lead inspector. His tone was formal but sympathetic. He confirmed what we already knew. The pool site had not only disturbed a functioning septic system, but had also caused partial contamination of the surrounding soil. Further excavation had exposed raw sewage due to damaged pipes, and the lack of any valid redirection plan meant the contamination had been flowing unchecked for days. I asked what would happen next. He didn't hesitate. The site would be shut down indefinitely. The HOA would face civil penalties for unauthorized development. And depending on how the permitting fraud was handled, Karen might face personal liability. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a satisfaction so deep it might have been mistaken for inner peace. But the story wasn't done. That night, I got a knock on my door. It was the elderly couple down the street, the same ones whose dog had gotten sick from the runoff. They brought a flash drive. On it was footage from their Ring camera. I took it, expecting to see some bulldozer chaos or maybe one of the workers sneaking a cigarette. Instead, I saw something far more valuable. It was Karen, standing in the middle of the yard 2 days before I returned from my trip, talking to the contractor. Her voice was crystal clear. "Don't worry about the permits," she said, waving her hand like she was swatting away flies. "By the time anyone realizes what we're doing, we'll be done." He never even checks his mail. I watched it 3 times, heart pounding. That wasn't just carelessness. That was premeditation. I sent the footage to the inspection team. I also forwarded it to the county zoning office, the HOA's insurance provider, and just for good measure, I dropped it in the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption. So about that pool, within an hour, the comments exploded. People were furious. Homeowners who had previously stayed quiet now shared their own horror stories. Karen had misused funds, ignored complaints, even threatened residents with bogus fines. The public sentiment flipped like a switch. Suddenly, I wasn't the neighbor making a fuss about a hole in the ground. I was the guy who caught the HOA queen red-handed. The next few days were pure chaos, and I stayed perfectly calm through all of it. Karen tried to hold another emergency meeting, this time to rally support and claim she was the victim of a smear campaign. She even printed out a stack of flyers accusing me of sabotaging community growth. At that point, her desperation had fully turned to delusion. The meeting turned into a full-blown mutiny. Half the attendees walked out. The other half stayed to grill her. And when someone asked about the misuse of funds, she had no answer. When asked about the missing permits, she blamed the contractor. And when asked about the septic field, she simply said, "I didn't think it was important." That was the moment the room truly turned. You could feel it shift, like a crowd realizing they'd been conned by a magician who just ran out of tricks. One man stood up and said, "You nearly poisoned half the block to build a pool nobody wanted." Another woman asked, "Did you even plan to pay for maintenance, or were you going to fine us all again next month?" Karen tried to regain control, but her voice was lost beneath the rising tide of anger. She left halfway through the meeting, flanked by two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. The next day, I received a formal request for my professional opinion on the site's remediation. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the City Health Office, now coordinating a full environmental recovery plan. I submitted my report, thorough and detailed. I listed every violation, every failure in oversight, and every consequence that should follow. I didn't embellish a single word. I didn't have to. The facts were damning enough. And then came the final twist, the cherry on top of Karen's rapidly melting sundae. A legal intern working on behalf of the city contacted me, curious about property ownership records. Turns out, Karen didn't even own the house she was living in. It was part of a post-divorce settlement she hadn't finalized. Technically, she had no legal right to represent the HOA as president. The entire time, she'd been bluffing on a foundation of lies, and now it was collapsing all at once. Everything was falling into place. And still, I stayed quiet. No gloating. No revenge speeches. Just observation. Because I knew the worst part for Karen wasn't going to be the fines, or the humiliation, or even the ruined pool. It would be the realization that the neighbor she dismissed as irrelevant was the one quietly dismantling her little empire, one inspection at a time. The official citations landed like thunderbolt. The HOA received not one, not two, but 7 separate violations, each with escalating consequences. Environmental contamination, unauthorized excavation, failure to obtain permit, improper waste disposal, endangerment of public health, misappropriation of community funds, and to top it off, falsification of records. Karen, who just weeks ago had marched around like a suburban general issuing edicts from her clipboard, now looked like someone who'd been dropped into a chess game 4 moves from checkmate. The worst part for her was that none of this could be swept under the rug. It was public. Neighbors were talking. Inspectors were returning. The city was getting involved. And I hadn't even shown my full hand yet. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. People who'd never attended a single vote were now glued to folding chairs, clutching copies of emails, printed screenshots, and HOA guidelines highlighted in angry yellow. Karen tried to call the meeting to order, but no one listened. It was chaos from the start. A mother stood up and accused Karen of lying about construction timelines and allowing noise violations during her toddler's nap schedule. A retired veteran demanded to know where his monthly dues had gone since the board hadn't filed a financial report in over 6 months. Another neighbor, furious about damage to his fence caused by construction trucks, threatened legal action. Karen tried to maintain control, but her voice was drowned in frustration. She slammed her gavel twice, something no one had ever seen her do, and shouted, You're all being manipulated." Then she looked directly at me. "You've turned this neighborhood against me," she hissed, pointing across the room like I'd rigged the whole show. I stood slowly, calmly, and for the first time, introduced myself not just as a homeowner, but as the Senior Environmental Health Compliance Officer for the state. You could hear the collective intake of breath. I explained my role, my credentials, and the documentation I'd submitted. I assured them I hadn't used my position to interfere, until Karen's actions made it a matter of public safety. Someone in the back clapped. Then another. And just like that, the room flipped. No more suspicion. No more confusion. Just relief. Because someone had finally stood up to her. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She stared at me like I was an apparition. Then, trembling with disbelief, she shouted, "This is a conflict of interest. He can't do this." I replied with a slight nod. "And yet I did nothing you couldn't have prevented by reading even a single page of protocol." From there, it unraveled fast. Board members began resigning, one after another, some in shame, others in frustration. Stan was the only one who stayed seated, quietly taking note. He later told me he was preparing to motion for Karen's immediate suspension as president pending investigation. But it never got that far. Karen, humiliated and cornered, threw her binder onto the table and stormed out of the room without another word. The next day, I received a call from the city's legal affairs department. They wanted my assistance in preparing a remediation order and possibly testifying if the HOA or Karen contested it. I agreed. I wasn't in it for revenge, but if it meant protecting my home and my neighbors from further damage, I'd go all the way. They asked for my full report, including the footage, the emails, the testimony from the neighbors. I had it all ready, packaged, indexed, and sealed tighter than a hazmat barrel. It felt good, in the way that cleaning out a moldy garage does, painful in the moment but necessary. Meanwhile, the half-built pool sat there like a monument to bad decisions. The orange cease and desist sign fluttered in the breeze, and the excavation site began to sink, literally and figuratively. With the septic field compromised and the heavy machinery having churned through protective layers of soil, minor sinkholes had started to form. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to make the structure unstable. Contractors wouldn't return to the site. The insurance company refused to pay the claim. And Karen, now absent from every HOA communication thread, had effectively vanished. A week later, she made one last desperate move. She sent out a mass email to the entire neighborhood claiming she'd been sabotaged by a vindictive neighbor with government connections, and that she would be filing a formal lawsuit against both the HOA and the state. It was laughable. Half the email was written in caps lock. The other half misquoted legal terms so badly it looked like she'd run it through an internet search and hoped for the best. No one responded. Instead, people shared the email in the Facebook group with comments like, "This is better than Netflix," and "Is this from a parody account?" With Karen gone, the remaining members of the HOA called for a reformation vote. A full reset. I didn't run for president. I had no interest in politics, especially not the flavor served at neighborhood potluck. But I did accept the position of compliance liaison, a non-voting advisory role designed to ensure something like this never happened again. Stan was elected as president, reluctant but respected. We worked together on rewriting the bylaws, this time with actual legal counsel. One of the first amendments passed unanimously. No new communal construction may proceed without 100% consent of directly affected property owners. No exceptions. The new board also launched an audit of HOA finances. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. Karen had authorized payments to shell contractors, falsified maintenance expenses, and had even purchased personal items using HOA funds. A custom patio umbrella, high-end kitchenware, and something labeled poolside aesthetic supplies, that turned out to be inflatable flamingos and luxury towels. When we submitted the findings to the city attorney, they opened a criminal investigation. I watched all of this unfold quietly, content to return to my life without machinery in my backyard or human waste leaking into my garden. The remediation plan involved restoring the septic field, testing the surrounding properties for contamination, and, eventually, removing the failed pool framework entirely. All costs were to be covered by the HOA's reserve fund and Karen's upcoming restitution requirements, should the charges stick. It would take months, but it was progress. Honest, grounded, undeniable progress. And yet, perhaps the most surreal moment came when a local news crew showed up. Apparently someone had tipped them off. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone from the city. They wanted to do a piece on the homeowner who stopped a health hazard. I didn't want fame, but they insisted on a brief interview. I kept it professional, talked about safety, responsibility, the importance of not underestimating a quiet neighbor with a good memory and a better file cabinet. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. My phone buzzed all night with texts from coworkers and friends. The clip even made it onto a subreddit dedicated to HOA horror stories, where it was voted to the top with the caption, "When Karen digs herself a hole right into your septic field." It was poetic in a way. The very system Karen ignored, the one meant to quietly, efficiently handle society's worst byproducts, had been her downfall. She'd tried to bury my home in waste, but ended up drowning in her own. The morning after the news segment aired, I opened my front door to find a box sitting on my porch. No return address, just a single word written on the top in black marker. "Thanks." Inside was a small ceramic gnome, but not just any gnome. This one was wearing a hazmat suit, holding a clipboard, and had a tiny badge around its neck that read, "Certified Health Inspector." At its feet, a miniature septic tank bubbled with fake sludge, sculpted in gross little swirls. It was so absurd, so perfectly ridiculous, that I laughed harder than I had in weeks. A note was taped underneath. 4 services above and below ground. From your grateful neighbors. The healing had begun. With Karen effectively exiled from the neighborhood, her house now officially listed for sale, her name blacklisted from the reformed HOA board, and her lawyer trying to untangle the mess she'd left, people started coming together in ways I hadn't seen before. There was a quiet sense of unity forming, like a neighborhood had collectively exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The backyard that once held the pit of doom was finally being restored. A proper team came in, tested and treated the soil, rebuilt the crushed leach lines, and backfilled the excavation site with care and precision. It was a long, meticulous process, but when they finally laid new sod over the space, it felt symbolic, like covering a scar that had finally stopped bleeding. One of the first community-wide changes we implemented was a monthly open forum, held in the clubhouse. The first session was a mix of celebration and catharsis. People shared stories, not just about Karen, but about years of ignored complaints, threatened fines for trivial things like wind chimes or garden gnomes, and the fear of speaking up. The HOA had become something people tiptoed around. Now it felt like something they could actually trust. And as strange as it was, I found myself being thanked constantly. At the mailbox, during walks, at the grocery store. Everyone seemed to have a version of the same sentiment. I didn't know what was going on until you stood up. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Karen's closest cronies, those who had benefited from her favoritism, were either laying low or subtly trying to rebrand themselves as victims of her manipulation. One in particular, a woman named Lydia, had once championed the pool project and mocked anyone who raised concerns. She sent me an awkwardly worded email asking if I'd consider supporting her nomination for the Community Culture Committee. I replied with a single sentence, "Let's give someone else a chance to set the tone." She didn't respond. The best part, though, was the subtle changes that made a big difference. Kids started playing outside again. People added lawn chairs to their front porches. One neighbor built a little lending library box near the walking trail, and someone else turned their side yard into a community herb garden. We even started organizing weekend potlucks with rotating hosts. I hosted the second one. I kept it simple: grilled burgers, iced tea, and a plastic kiddie pool filled with ice and drinks, but the turnout was amazing. There were no awkward conversations, no tension, just laughter and stories and a shared sense of having weathered something insane together. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized I'd gotten exactly what I wanted. Not just justice, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing your home is safe, your neighbors have your back, and the rules exist to protect, not punish. That was something worth fighting for. And somehow, in the weirdest possible way, a rogue pool project had brought us all closer. Of course, there were still loose ends. Karen's civil case with the city was ongoing. From what I heard through official channels, she was facing potential charges for fraud, environmental negligence, and misappropriation of community funds. The legal process would take time, but the damage to her reputation was already done. Her home sat on the market for weeks with no offers. Eventually, she dropped the price low enough to draw in an investor, who planned to rent it out. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. Karen, who once demanded neighborhood purity and enforced aesthetic standards with an iron fist, had inadvertently created a rental property next door to herself. The HOA voted unanimously to prohibit her from ever holding a board position again, should she somehow return. Not that anyone believed she would. Her last known update on the Facebook group was a short message before she was removed. "This community doesn't deserve progress." The top reply was just a gif of a dumpster on fire. The second reply said, "You tried to build a pool on a toilet. Sit down." One afternoon, Stan and I were walking the neighborhood, doing a routine compliance check. Not the kind that involved citations, but the kind that ensured everything stayed transparent. We passed the old pit site, now covered in green grass and home to a new flower bed someone had started. Stan shook his head and said, "Hard to believe this was almost a pool." I nodded. "A pool full of bad decisions." He laughed. "You ever think about how different this would have been if you weren't a health inspector?" I thought about that. I probably would have ended up with sewage backing into my bathtub and a nervous breakdown. Stan grinned. "Instead, you turned into some kind of folk hero. I'm just a guy who wanted to flush his toilet without needing a hazmat team." He paused, then reached into his bag and handed me a small plaque. I turned it over. It read, "In recognition of outstanding service to the neighborhood, the Septic Avenger." I nearly dropped it from laughing. We mounted it on the clubhouse wall that afternoon. As the weeks rolled on, the scandal faded into something resembling neighborhood folklore. People still talked about it, especially when warning new board members about the dangers of unchecked power. And I kept the gnome on my front porch, right next to the mailbox, where it became a bit of a mascot. Sometimes kids would giggle at it and ask why it wore a spacesuit. I'd just smile and say, "Because it saved the whole block." The funny thing was, I never wanted to be involved in HOA politics. I never wanted to be the guy making speeches or calling inspectors or organizing meetings. But sometimes, when someone digs a hole deep enough, you either let them bury you in it or you climb down, drag them out, and fill it back up the right way. And if you're lucky, you do it with neighbors who cheer you on, a flower bed where the mess used to be, and a ceramic gnome that reminds you it's okay to laugh after everything goes down the drain.